you to Cambridge University Press for bringing me here, which is always a pleasure, Cambridge being such a lovely place. I need to give a bit of context, just to make sure that we know where we are. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is bilingual education. And by bilingual education, I mean the situation where a content subject is taught partly or completely through a foreign language, most frequently English. Okay? This comes alongside more regular language classes. So we would have, like, for example, biology being taught through English plus normal EFL class. As Rupert was mentioning, I work at the University of Halbach, and we do have a large-scale bilingual project there. The focus today is not going to be on the organization, which is what my colleagues Montserrat and Natalia will be doing, I think, later today. I'm going to talk more about the methodology, so what happens when we put language at the center of our teaching. And my children, I've got 4 children, they say I'm very impatient. And I always start everything right in the middle. So I tried today not to go straight into the middle, but take a step back first and ask myself, or ask ourselves, why should we place language at the center of our teaching? Well, the reason is fairly simple. In mother tongue teaching, we can take language as a given. We don't have to worry about our students understanding what we say because, you know, it's their mother tongue, so they should be understanding us. Whether or not they do is a different question, which I'm not going to go into because that would take us too far. But in mother tongue teaching, most content subject teachers will not think too much about the language. They just take it as a given. In bilingual education, it's not the same because we are teaching through a language that for many students will be their foreign language. Okay? Sometimes it's a second language, but in our context at least, it's a foreign language. So I cannot take language for granted anymore. It's something I have to think about. So, first little conclusion here, in bilingual education, we need to think about language. We cannot just take it for granted. But also, we need to think about language because language is key in what we do. Okay? Language is necessary for several reasons. First of all, language is necessary to understand. That's quite obvious. Our textbooks are written. Our mode of teaching is very much oral. We explain things. And to explain, we can use diagrams and we can use all sorts of things, but we mainly use language. So if we want our students to understand, we need to think about language. We also need to think about language because language is necessary for students to communicate. Very often when we think about teaching, we think about the language that the teacher uses. Will students be able to understand what I say to them? Will they be able to read this text? But we don't so often think about, will they be able to communicate? Do they have the language necessary to communicate about what I'm teaching them? For me, one of the experiences that brought this home to me, or is a good example rather than brought this home, is my daughter, my eldest daughter, coming out of her room one dinner time, saying, well, after I knew she had been studying, she had been revising for a chemistry exam. So I said to her, Sarah, how are you doing? And she said, well, I think I know my stuff. Can I tell it to you? And this "can I tell it to you" for her was the way to see if she was able to explain it and if she'd learned it well. So this shows you the importance of students being able to communicate. If we don't give them the language, how can they know that they know? If they know, okay? So we really need to think of language as a tool for communication, also for the students. And finally, language is very important to mediate and structure knowledge. If I now shout into the room a word that I pronounce very badly in English, but for some reason it always comes to my mind, let's see what happens. If I say photosynthesis, maybe somebody here in the room knows about photosynthesis. And if you do, this word will trigger all these ideas that you have about photosynthesis. For some of us, it's only very little. It's got to do with plants and sunlight and something. But for some of you, this might be a lot. So language is a tool that mediates and structures knowledge. If we don't have language, it's very difficult to retrieve this knowledge. Okay, how do you access this knowledge that you have stored? So, as I said before, language needs to become part of our planning. It needs to become part of our teaching. And therefore, I have to think about it when I plan my teaching. And this has consequences, very important consequences, for teachers, for the content teachers who teach biology, chemistry, history, whatever, through English, but also for the language teacher. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is look first at the content teacher and then at the language teacher and see what consequences this has. What does it mean when a teacher focuses or pays attention to language in his teaching, in his planning? Let's start with the content teacher. The content teacher very often is a trained biologist or a trained specialist in whatever subject and is not necessarily language aware. Okay? If you can think of the teachers you work with or the teachers you train, very often they don't have language awareness, but when they teach the foreign language, they do need this language awareness. This is not often part of the initial teacher training, at least in the context I come from. Biology teachers, mathematics teachers, chemistry teachers are specialists in their field, but not in language. And many of them don't think it's their business. Okay? They don't see it as their role. So often they reject this part of the job. They don't feel comfortable with it. However, if through teacher training, if through leadership, as we heard before, if we're able to make teachers more language aware, then it's likely that our teaching or the teacher's teaching moves away from being language mediated, meaning only through language, to more action oriented. Okay? By being aware of the fact that my students don't speak the language, don't have access to the language as easily as if I was teaching in the mother tongue, I as a teacher try to support my teaching through other means that are not only language related. Okay? And that very often makes my teaching more action mediated, more active. And of course we all know this quote by Benjamin Franklin, "Tell me and I forget," and so on. Okay? So by making it more action oriented, by making it supported by more action, we are likely to actually improve our teaching. Also, through greater language awareness, if my content teachers are able to develop greater language awareness, teaching becomes more learner-centered. And I put some sneakers there. In a way, the teacher has to think from the student's perspective. They have to put themselves into the student's shoes, thinking of the difficulty to access the knowledge, the difficulty to communicate about the knowledge, and the difficulty to retrieve the knowledge, thinking in terms of language. So we think about the sources of difficulty, and we also think about the students' language needs. If I want them to understand this, if I want them to do this task, what sort of language do they need? And this is something that teachers are often aware of, but not very good sometimes at doing. Here, for example, I brought an example from a teacher training college, which in my area teaches through English. Okay? And they do something very simple. You're going to see it on the next slide. They give the students the language. They feed it in. They don't take it for granted, but they give students the language that they need, in this case, to comment on statistics. You have expressions there. Can you read them? The type is very small. I'm just going to give you a few examples if I can make this work. For example, here, this would be that the level peaks at or reaches a peak or reaches a high. It's not just single words, as you see. It's expressions that the students need to use to explain a graph, to comment on statistics in this case, and so on. Okay? So you're not just making sure that the students understand what the teacher says, but that the students are able to then process this information and work on it by means of language. Now this comes from a tool that this teacher training college has created, which is what they call a language fan. They have little cards which are joined by a key ring here in the middle, there. And on each card, they have language functions. So one card will be about agreeing, disagreeing. Another one is the one about statistics I showed you. A third is about descriptions. The fourth is about processes, and so on. So that the students, whenever they have to do something, can resort to this language bank, in a way, in order to be able to actually use the language and have it available. Okay? So this is something that the content teachers need to do. They need to think in terms of the needs of the students. This doesn't make them very happy. Because content teachers tend to be stressed out, don't they? They have such a lot of content to cover. How can they teach content and language? Okay? Now, what this teacher doesn't know, or maybe he knows or she knows, but doesn't think of, is that language actually brings about learning. It's not an added, okay? It's not an added burden to the content teacher, but it's actually what is going to make learning happen. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a minute. And also that there's always the language teacher. I come from a context where coordination and collaboration is absent. It doesn't exist among teachers. So this is quite a challenge, and that is one of the reasons why our content teachers very rarely think of the language teacher as a resource, somebody to work with. Okay, let's turn to the first of these. Language brings about learning. This is something that happened to me in last autumn in a teacher training session at my university. I was trying to explain to my students, all of them are practicing teachers and many of them are native speakers of English, how language and learning cannot be separated. And a student had given us an example of a meander. So I asked them to define what a meander is. Remember that part of these students are native speakers, okay? A meander, I'm sure you know, is this bend of the river, okay? But I didn't just ask them to define, I said them how to define. And I gave them this little structure. I said X, the meander, is a whatever, that, this is the structure I want you to use. So they all said, okay, they got together in pairs, and after a few seconds, some of the native speakers started to laugh. And of course, that's a very unsettling feeling when your students start to laugh. And I said, what's wrong? And they said, you know, we thought we knew what a meander is, but because we have to use this structure, we don't know. We have realized that we don't really know what it is. Okay, so this structure, just giving them the structure, helped them realize where their gaps in their knowledge were. And now they could work together on filling the gaps in this knowledge. Okay? And this is this is an example of how powerful language is to make learning happen. By giving you the structure, by giving you, or by expressing an idea, I actually see whether I know what I'm talking about or not. How many times have you realized what you're thinking by talking about it? Hasn't this ever happened to you? That you end a conversation and you think, ooh, I didn't really know I thought this. Well, that's the power of language. Okay. So, this is the content teacher side. Let's now turn to the language teacher. I said before, the content teacher is not aware that he has a language teacher alongside him or her. So the language teacher needs to support the language development for content teaching, meaning that if the content teacher is going to work on materials, that is going to imply a lot of relative clauses, for example. So he should go to his colleague in the language classes and say, okay, in 2 weeks' time, I need some relative clauses for my students. Can you work on them? So that when the time comes that the content teacher needs them, they can actually be available. The language teacher has already done the job. That means that they need to coordinate. And as I said, in my context, that's not very frequent. And also, the language teacher faces a new challenge, and a challenge that he or she may be very uncomfortable with. What is this challenge? The challenge is that the language that the students learn is determined by the content subject, and there is no grammatical sequencing. The history teacher cannot wait for a year and a half till the language teacher has done the past tenses to start teaching. Okay? They just have to start using past tenses because that's what they're talking about. We cannot do history in the present tense. And that, of course, is very stressful to the language teachers because there is no order anymore. And students learn language outside the language lesson, so the teacher doesn't know anymore what they're talking about, what they know, what they don't know, and doesn't know really what he or she has to teach. But as they say, I don't know if this is true, I heard it's not true, in Chinese, the challenge does also mean the opportunity. I don't know if that's true, or the symbol, is it true? Okay, so any challenge has an opportunity, okay? And we're going to focus on the opportunity, trying to be positive. The opportunity is obviously that students will have a higher level, right? And having a higher level means that students are exposed to much more language, and for some teachers, having a higher level means, okay, good, I can do a book and a half instead of just one book every year. Okay, obviously publishers like Cambridge University Press would be thrilled because having a book and a half instead of one is always good for the figures, but that's not the point. Students also have a greater motivation. There have been lots of studies measuring this, but it's also obvious that somebody who needs the language to learn content will have a different motivation to a student who just learns the language as a subject. Okay? There is a real life use. There is a real need to develop this knowledge of the language. And there is a greater willingness to communicate. In our context, language has been taught for a long time as a lot of grammar and a lot of vocabulary, but very little communication. Now these students are communicating through the language all the time because they are learning their biology, they are learning their history, they are learning their chemistry in the language. So they are more willing to communicate. And therefore, there has to be a change in teaching approach for EFL in this case. It's not that there has to be, but if we want to make best use of the resources and of the situation, it's logical for there to be one. We can work at a higher level. We already said that. Students have a greater exposure to the language, which means that they will be better at it, and therefore our teaching can be aimed at a higher level. In my context, again, students used to finish high school, leave high school with a B1, or getting there, rather than really achieving it. Now, with the bilingual program, they're leaving school with a C1. That is a difference, right? So, we can teach at a higher level, which is good for teachers, because they don't have to just do the basics. And there's more communication, so it can be more fun, it can be more enjoyable, because we can use the language, we can use it at a higher level. And we also need to prepare students for the challenges of the content subject. What are these challenges? First of all, in the content subject, students encounter texts. So we need to focus our teaching above the sentence level. I don't know if that's your experience, but in my context, very often teaching is focused on the sentence rather than text. There is very little work on the structure of texts, on how I organize ideas in a text, how I develop an argument, okay? But now we need students who are able to answer essay questions in exams, who are able to read texts, longer texts, more complex texts, and when they are asked to read, it's not just for the sake of comprehension, it's for the sake of learning a content subject. So the importance of reading is much greater. You have to be able to understand. Also, we need to include work on strategies because our students don't have the language. They need to make do with the language they have. They need to make use the resources they have as best they can. Obviously, this will mean that they need to work with strategies, communication strategies, cognitive strategies, metacognitive strategies to make their learning as effective as possible. We also need to include focus on form. Some people at the beginning of CLIL said no focus on form, we're just using the language. But as we know from the Canadian experience of immersion teaching, we need this focus on form to make sure that the language develops appropriately. But of course, students don't want to be taught the past tense. They want to be taught the past tense when they use it in the context of a history lesson, in the context of whatever they're doing. Okay, this, maybe I should stay with this for a little while. This is, of course, a challenge. Maybe in your context this all happens, not in mine, in the language lessons. So at my university, we have been thinking about this for quite a while, and we came up with a different approach to teaching English. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what this approach means. I would love to be able to bring you into a classroom because that's where you really notice what's happening. But I'm going to show you two students performing in English to give you a feel. So what we do is, rather than start, as we often do, even though we have had communicative language teaching for a long time, we often start with structures or with grammatical topics. Instead of doing that, what we do is we decide on a written or spoken aim, on a text type. So you see that we are situating learning immediately above the sentence level, not at the text level, above the sentence level. Once we have decided what kind of oral or written text we want our students to produce, this could be an advert, it could be a book review, it could be a comment, a running comment on a fashion show, it could be anything. We look at what distinguishes this text in terms of text features, okay? What sort of organization is typical for this kind of text? What sort of language is typical for this text? But it's not words, it's expressions we're looking at, okay? It's language chunks. Then, once we have done this, we find appropriate input. So we find a model text. As I said, a running commentary on a fashion show, an advert. I had a student working on tongue twisters with her students. So whatever we can think of. Once we have this appropriate input, we can start working on our students, and we work on comprehension. We're not working on the model text just as a model. We're also working on it in terms of comprehension, understanding, enjoying the text, and so on. What we have identified here is worked on with the students here through different kinds of exercises. This is very open, so what exercise goes into each stage is very flexible. Okay? But what is important for us is that when we ask our students to produce a text, the text that we decided we wanted them to produce, they have the necessary tools to do so. So basically what we're doing here is scaffolding. We are scaffolding students' production for the end. Here, the scaffolding is based on the text analysis, and in the next stage, it's based on guided practice of the features that we're working on. And finally, we have a final product, which is a spoken or written text. Okay? Now we're going to bring this down on the level of a classroom, and I'm going to show you the work one of my PhD students is doing with her class of primary school students. She's working on the book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I'm sure many of you know. And the features of this, well, this is a fourth year primary school. So the features we have is that they are reading a long story. The students are reading a story that is not just one textbook page long or a few paragraphs long, but it's a long story. It's an engaging story. These students produce things for the teacher like golden tickets or chocolate cakes. Those of you who are familiar with the story will know why this is relevant, because it's all about a chocolate factory and winning a golden ticket to go and see this chocolate factory. But they are also analyzing the language in the story. So they are looking at the language as it's being used inside the story. They do language work in response to the story. So you will see this on the next slide, or 2 slides on. I'm going to show you a little writing by a third-year student. They do a lot of group and pair work, and they have loads of opportunities to communicate. Okay, I brought you a little video that needs some explanation, so just a minute. This is a student who entered the school in September. This was taken in the month of December. This is a student who had lots of problems in his previous school. That's why he joined a fourth year primary group in September. The teacher said to me, he's crying every single day because he doesn't understand anything. Until the moment they worked on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Can we watch the video now, please?
Ingredients: 1 piece of cake, 600 grams of whipping cream, 3 envelopes of card.
Okay, that's enough. You can see this is very hesitant, but this is the first time the student speaks in English. Why does he speak in English? Because going with the story, he made a chocolate cake at home, and he brought the recipe to school. And he's explaining to his fellow students how he made this chocolate cake. For him, this was like the threshold he crossed. The first time he was motivated to speak, the first time he was able to speak. I'm going to show you some more. This is about a different unit. This time is third year primary. Again, Roald Dahl. This teacher loves Roald Dahl, so she chooses it. This is a story of a girl who's got a magic finger, and every time she gets cross and points her magic finger at somebody, something horrible happens. Okay? You can see that children get engaged. They point their magic fingers at each other. You can also see this. This is a shame, you can't read it. Do you know this man at the bottom? Can you imagine who this is? Trump? Yes, this is Donald Trump. Okay? One of the teaching points in this unit is relative clauses. So this is a piece of homework from the student, who has to create a sentence using a relative clause of place. And this is what he writes. Washington is the place where Donald Trump lives in his White House. Okay, this is free production, third year primary, 3 years of English, relative clause achieved. Okay, he's able to do this. And this recording, which I think I can make work, is again a very problematic student in this class. She's diagnosed TDAH, okay? So she's hyperactive, and she's got very bad marks. She can't concentrate. You can see that perfectly in the video. But she's actually producing a lot of English, and she's producing a sentence which is, she is very cross. And this is one of the sentences that comes directly from the book, one of the expressions. So listen to Andrea.
Miss Andreita, tell me what happened when you feel really, really angry.
Okay, I have some things. When my brother, I say to him if I can play with an Xbox, and he say no, and really starts to say things very bad.
All right.
Oh, when I'm playing one thing of a game named Roblox, that is Cats of Forest.
Mm-hmm.
No, Forest Cats. One day make me bullying and ban me. Really.
And that day?
And that,
what happened that day?
That that I got really, I get really cross. One thing, when some people are playing with.
Okay, you can see how they use the language that they learn in the lesson spontaneously, talking about themselves. And this is the difference that this kind of approach is making to these students. Not the bright ones. The bright ones will learn with anything, but the weaker ones. And that's what is interesting. Okay, so then this is wrapping it up. When we put language at the center of our teaching, we are likely to change the teaching of content and the foreign language. And we're likely to change it into some more effective, more meaningful, and more language-centered teaching. Thank you very much.